Welcome to Press the Button's 2021 Roundup, a unique episode that lets us recap the nuclear news of the year. I'm Michelle Dover, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Tom Collina, and Ploughshares President Emma Belcher.
Hey, Michelle. Great to be here with you both. It's great to be here at the end of the year, entering the holiday season. I'm still getting used to my fake Christmas tree, but I'm sort of accepting it as the practical over the magical. But it's becoming a little bit more normal in my house as we've actually decorated the tree. It looks pretty good. So we're accepting it. And, it seems just like yesterday that President Biden was sworn into the Oval Office. I can't believe a whole year has gone by. I still remember taking a huge sigh of relief when the nuclear football was transitioned from former President Trump to President Biden. That was a significant, if underappreciated moment, and it doesn't seem as long ago as it actually was.
Well, that's right, Tom. I'm really happy to join both of you. What a year it's been. I'm happy to say, actually, Tom, that I have a real Christmas tree, so we might have to have a Christmas tree face-off at some point. But putting the jokes aside, as we reflect on the year, how many incredible guests have we had on the podcast? Really discussing issues of nuclear policy from Russia to China. And so, Tom and Michelle, I wanted to see what your biggest takeaways of the year have been. Let's start with you, Michelle. What stands out to you from this past year?
Oh, man. I think 2021 for me was just a year of change. So we already talked about it, the change in the U.S. presidents and what that meant for the change in the rhetoric, in potentially some of the threat levels from 2020 to 2021. The change in conversation. The ban treaty was ratified. The humanitarian impact discussion has continued to grow abroad, but I'm also seeing it here in the U.S., especially with the discussion about what to do about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, and in some ways reflecting as well the deeper discussion here in the U.S. about what justice means to the nuclear issue. So in the other changes, diversity and inclusion. So I would say yes, that following the protests of last year, following the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, yes, you did see fewer people in the streets, but you've continued to see a push for change. Even the writings and the articles I'm seeing in outlets like Inkstick, Bulletin, and others, the growth we've seen in gender champions, in Orgs in Solidarity, how they've become centers of activity in the field. And as well, the number of, you're seeing it in the policies, right? In the personnel, I should say. You're seeing it in the personnel, the number of women appointed to the Biden administration. I think one of the highlights for me was Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins' speech to the Conference on Disarmament, where she called out that they were not changing and being more inclusive, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you go watch it. But the policy still feels stuck. I don't know. How about you, Tom?
Definitely. I mean, I think, thinking back at the year and the new Biden administration coming in, we had high expectations, probably unrealistically so, high expectations for the Biden administration. And it was a disappointing year. I mean, let's be honest. It's been a really disappointing year on nuclear policy. The administration got a very positive start, give them credit for this, with extension of the New START treaty. It's one of the first things they did when they got into office in January. And it was really important to do. And so they got off on a really, really good start, extended New START with Russia, and then started follow-on strategic stability talks with Russia going forward. So that all started really positively, although even that is now, there's a big question mark around that with Russia threatening Ukraine, whether Russia is going to invade Ukraine and what that means for the strategic stability talks going forward. So big question mark there, but the administration gets full credit for going forward on New START extension. But then, we got this real whopper of a disappointment in the Pentagon budget. The budget that the Biden administration submitted to Congress was just the same old, same old. Huge sort of overspending on the Pentagon, with all of the Trump administration's nuclear priorities in there, all the weapons that we have been complaining about during the Trump administration that were excessive and unnecessary. In particular, the new ground-based ballistic missile, the ICBM, all that stuff still in there, submitted by the Biden administration. So that was a big disappointment. And then as we saw as the year went on, Congress actually adding to that budget to the point now where it's just large beyond any meaningful reason to be that large. That was a disappointing process. And now, here we are, something that the administration started off seemingly well was renegotiating, getting back into the Iran nuclear deal. But even there, they could have gone faster than they did. They could have been clear out of the gate that they wanted to be back in the Iran nuclear deal with Iran, prepared to make concessions to make that possible. Instead, they were pretty slow on the uptake. And now where we are, I think there's probably some regrets that the administration didn't do more sooner. Because here we are in December, and the outlook for the talks looks pretty bleak. So we'll have to see where this goes. I think January will be critical, but certainly you can't have an optimistic outlook on expectations for where we're going to go with the Iran nuclear deal. So another big news item of the year was China discovered to be building hundreds of new missile silos, which we presume will be nuclear, but we don't know at this point. China moving forward with hypersonic weapons tests. And of course, then we have the DC policy community hyping that threat to justify ever bigger defense budgets. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be worried about what China's doing, but I think we have to see it more realistically as China responding to what they see as a U.S. threat. The U.S. arsenal being larger, much, much larger than China's. Our missile defenses being something that makes China very concerned about their ability to retaliate to a U.S. strike, and the possibility of cyber attacks from both sides on each other's nuclear weapons infrastructure and early warning. So, I think if you look at it in that context, what we need is not more defense spending, not more threatening language at China, but more diplomacy, more arms control. So I'm happy to see that the administration is trying to start a strategic stability dialogue with China. And I think that's exactly the right way to go. And we have to be careful not to turn into a new arms race with China, although that seems to be where it's going. I think we're going to see a lot of the implications of the China developments in the administration's nuclear posture review, the NPR. That should be out, in the next few months, the beginning of 2022. Reading the tea leaves, I would say this is going to be another missed opportunity for the Biden administration. This is a great opportunity for Biden to put his personal prints on what nuclear policy will be. There's a great opportunity here to reduce the president's authority to start nuclear war. We saw with President Trump, of course, the dangers of one unhinged president and what they could potentially do. Great opportunity to declare the no first use of nuclear weapons to reduce the dangers of accidental war and to get out of some of these, huge budget implications of new ICBMs and things of that nature, to save money, to not spend money on things that actually makes us less safe, and put this into things we really need, like COVID responses, international vaccines, things of that nature. But here I am dumping a lot on the Biden administration. I do want to give them credit for one major thing they did, which was getting out of Afghanistan. This was a huge, huge lift in this year. Again, it didn't go that well, right? No one would say that the way the United States got out of Afghanistan was the way you'd want to do it. But the important thing was to get out of Afghanistan. And they did that. And I think 5 years from now, we'll look back at this as truly one of the most important things that the Biden administration did. Just a few sort of personal highlights for the year. I really was concerned, after the riots on the Capitol, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, that we had an unhinged president with his finger on the button. And it really was, to me, a harrowing 2 weeks between that time and when Biden took over on January 20th as to, what is Trump going to do? Would Trump actually do something? Luckily, he did not, but I think we just got lucky. And so for me, that was a very tense moment, actually. It was somewhat gratifying to see the policy community and the media actually confront the issue of sole authority and to question it, although it turned out to be a fleeting moment, but at least we had that. I had the personal experience, which was really interesting, to be able to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee over the summer and actually have the ability to make my case firsthand, one-on-one with senators, to explain to them why things like land-based ballistic missiles make no sense. So that was gratifying. It was really, really fascinating experience, and I'm glad I was able to do that. Lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about our Press the Button Live event that we had this fall, which was tremendous. I hope people got a chance to see it. If you didn't, it's on our website. Please check it out. As people who saw it know, we had Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner on the show. He came at the end of the show, but actually he was supposed to come as one of our first speakers on the show. And of course, as luck would have it, with his very busy position, he got called away. So we had this gap in the agenda right off the bat. And I just want to give a shout out to Ben Rhodes, Ploughshares board member, who was next up in the queue, and he was able to slide up earlier in the episode and save the day by being flexible and being able to shift his time up into the schedule, which really made the whole thing work. So shout out to Ben Rhodes. Thanks very much.
Tom, I still have gray hairs from those 10 minutes. So Ben, thank you, because without you, I think I would have more.
Well, certainly that was a harrowing experience, and thanks again to Ben for coming in, saving the day. But I also need to give kudos to you, Tom, and you, Michelle, because we had to really rearrange the schedule, and our first sort of 10-minute riffing was not planned. So we tried to plug up the time, and we just had a little bit of a chat about nuclear policy. And I think it went pretty smoothly. So thanks to both of you for jumping in there and improvising on the day. Some of those things that I'm sure our listeners don't really get to see. I think Tom and Michelle, you've outlined a whole lot of really fascinating, positive, but also not as positive developments that have happened over the year. And certainly a ton has happened. And nuclear news also dominated the headlines in my home country of Australia this year, with the announcement of the somewhat strangely named AUKUS agreement amongst the US, UK and Australia. You know, in an unprecedented move, the US is proposing to share technology with Australia for nuclear-powered submarines. And why this got people's attention is that the US has really had a long-standing policy of not sharing this dangerous technology with countries that don't have nuclear weapons because of its highly sensitive nature and proliferation risk. And in fact, the US has only previously shared this technology with the UK, which already has nuclear weapons. So this really did catch non-proliferation experts by surprise, and it raised a lot of questions about precedent, and people are rightly questioning the impact of this on the non-proliferation regime. And for many of us, it seemed to come out of the blue. It certainly ruffled some feathers across the Atlantic, with France, that actually did have a contract with Australia for providing submarines, having its contract ripped up. You know, questions about how far in advance did France know this? So there's a bit of a diplomatic snafu with France recalling ambassadors to Australia and the US. So while President Biden seems to have smoothed things over somewhat with France, admitting that maybe it could have been handled better, Australia doesn't seem to quite have repaired relations just yet. So it'll be interesting to see where all of this goes and how this deal comes about, if it does. So that was something that really stood out for me this year.
Okay, before though we're done with 2021, because I hear you both on the news thing, let's talk Press the Button real quick in terms of what your most memorable episodes were this year. And while you're thinking about it, I'll start. Tom, Press the Button Live was wild. But for me, I think what was most memorable was something that Dr. Caitlin Turner said on the panel I moderated about how, as we think about nuclear policy work or disarmament, or if you are someone who thinks there should be more nuclear weapons, how you think about that technology and building it, a key conversation that's missing from the debate is, what do we owe the land and the people on the land that are being affected by nuclear weapons programs, whether they're building up or their disarmament? That really pushed me to think outside of my DC bubble. The other one that stayed with me is the conversation I had with Terrell Starr, where he made the point that China may not be just looking at what Biden's going to do, but they're actually already looking at 2024 and the long-term picture of where the U.S. arsenal was going. And that sounds like a really simple thing, but for me, it really forced me to think outside of my, current mindset. So I think big props to those guests.
Well, Michelle, my most memorable episode of the year caused me to think outside the box in a way. It's the one I did with neuroscientist Moran Cerf on the bomb and the brain. And he had this suggestion that we take humans out of the equation when it comes to decision making on launching nuclear weapons. Now, Tom, I know that gave you, in particular, that gave you heartburn.
It did. I mean, we all know machines are fallible, computers are fallible, and nuclear weapons are vulnerable to cyber attacks. So to me, leaving computers in charge of all this is the ultimate nightmare. But please continue.
Well, no, I would agree. I think, I kind of get it why maybe you might want to take humans out of the equation if you've got concern about issues of rationality and all the rest, and acting under pressure when they've only got a few minutes to make a decision. It's tempting to wonder whether an AI system might make a better or more rational decision than a human being with all its fallibility, as you've mentioned. But I think we've seen historically that removing humans from the decision-making loop will only increase the risk of an accident. We've seen this time and time again, that humans intervening in a decision-making process has prevented the rush to nuclear war when technological errors have produced some very close calls. But, in any case, there's clearly a debate here to be had, right, as we think about how nuclear technologies impact the nuclear space. How about you, Tom? What was your most memorable interview?
Thanks. It has been a great year on Press the Button. A lot of interesting interviews. Hard to pick my favorite. But if I'm forced to choose one, I would have to say it was an interview I did a few months ago with Sarah Strader. She's executive director of the Secure Families Initiative. And she was talking about the impact of the relentless and endless wars, well, finally ending one at least, of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the effects those wars have had on veterans and current military families. It's a side of this story kind of going behind the news that we don't often hear about is, we hear about the endless wars, but we don't hear about how that affects people who are actually fighting those wars. So it was really interesting to hear what she had to say. It was a great interview. It gave me a lot more sensitivity and empathy for what's going on in the military families. So I think and hope that our listeners got a lot out of it. And to me, it's what's so gratifying about doing these interviews on Press the Button is we really can go behind the news. We can sort of take a deep dive. To me, this year, some of the issues that we did that on were Afghanistan. We did a number of episodes on Afghanistan, but also on China, trying to unravel the puzzle that is China and what are they doing and why, and cybersecurity, as Emma, we just discussed. So these are just some of the deep issues that really require a lot of thinking and discussion, and it's great to be part of this podcast to help us do that. And looking forward, why don't we look to see what we might be expecting happening next year in 2022? Michelle, what are you looking at?
So what I'm looking towards, or I should say I'm looking forward to, I'm looking forward to seeing people. And I know we're taping this as Omicron is rising and we are probably going into, another form of lockdown. But, continuing that theme for me of, I think we're going to continue to see a push for change. Whether or not we reach that change, I think that's, a real question. But what I'm looking forward to is working with people, hopefully in some form of in-person, at appropriate times this year. Because that's, for me, how we're going to, if we can, avert escalation with China or with Russia. And for me, I'm looking forward to that, to coming up with the ideas of, how do you now push for disarmament when all of the countries are modernizing their arsenals? So that's what I'm looking forward to. And Emma, it's been your first full calendar year as president. So extra, what's exciting you?
Well, what excites me is the real appetite people seem to have for truly transformational change. Something I think you were just talking about, Michelle. The interest that people have in bringing new minds and perspectives to bear on these problems that we wrestle with on a daily basis. There seems to be a growing willingness to challenge the status quo, to think big and about longer term issues. So that excites me. I'm also excited by the willingness I've seen of people to come together to do this kind of work, to think about how to creatively address problems, how we can work better together, what lessons we can learn from other fields, and how can we partner with others who share our vision of a safer and more secure world for all. And the other thing that's exciting me is the first anniversary of the ban treaty in January and the first meeting of states parties in March in Vienna. And what's really interesting about this is that many people didn't think this treaty would be possible. You know, people have strong opinions about it, either for or against it, but it's really notable what has been achieved here. Now, while there aren't any US allies that have joined, Norway is going to observe the conference. And we also see that a number of cities have joined ICANN's Cities Appeal to call on their governments to join the TPNW. New York City, home of the Manhattan Project, just being the latest. So I'll be really eager to see what comes out of this meeting, to see what the next steps are and what might be possible in the future.
And just some other things for our listeners to keep their eye on, things that might be happening early next year. Biden's nuclear posture review should be out in the first few months. I think, as we said, January will be pivotal for the Iran nuclear talks, whether those talks will succeed or not. We're continuing to track the Taiwan situation and whether Taiwan provokes a military conflict between China and the United States. Strongly hope that it does not. And similarly in Ukraine, we've got tens of thousands of Russian troops camped out on the border with Ukraine. We'll see where that goes in January. And again, hoping for a diplomatic solution there. But Michelle, let me hand it back to you.
Tom, Emma, our time on the podcast today, just like 2021, is nearly up. So before we go, though, I just want to say thank you to both of you for being such wonderful co-hosts and occasional hosts. It's always great to have these conversations. And I'm really looking forward to 2022, which I hope will not rhyme with 2020. I want to give a shout out to our listeners. Thank you for hanging in there this year and following us, and for your ideas, your feedback. We say it every show, but it really is what makes the show better. And a huge thank you to guests who I think we have taped these interviews in everything from, closets to kitchen tables to cars. It's really been a great ride. And Tom, I'm with you. I really enjoy this part of the show of just being able to talk to people and learn and listen and hear their stories.
And I'd also like to give a shout out to our awesome team here at Press the Button. Not just to Tom and Michelle, the wonderful hosts who you hear each week, but to those who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes over this past year. That's Lauren Billett, Jack Brown, Chase Enright, Doreen Horschig, Desiree Pettis, Harry Tarpey, Jacqueline Singh, Angela Kellett, Alex Hall, Will Lowry, Del Vigil, and Derek Zender. You do all fabulous work behind the scenes that people don't get to see, but we see you.
Tom, final thoughts?
Just, reiterate what you said, Michelle. It's been great co-hosting this with you. Emma, great co-hosting this with you. It's really a lot of fun. And let's do it again in the new year.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kellett, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Mitchell, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Pettis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.